Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1912, and the small town of Ellsworth Creek, nestled in the Missouri Ozarks, was about to become the setting for one of the most disturbing events in the region's history. What happened at the Taney County Courthouse on that cold November morning would be systematically erased from official records, mentioned only in hushed whispers, and eventually banned from history books. The incident, which locals would later refer to simply as the Silence, claimed the lives of 17 people. Yet what makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the loss of life, but the meticulous effort to erase it from collective memory. According to documents uncovered in 1965 during a renovation of the county archives, the massacre occurred on November 12, 1912, during what should have been a routine court proceeding. Judge Everett Holcomb was presiding over a land dispute case between the prominent Keller family and several local farmers. The courthouse was reportedly filled to capacity that morning. By noon, 17 people were dead. No shots were heard. No screams reported. Just silence. What truly happened inside those courthouse walls remains a subject of speculation even today. The few documents that survived suggest something far more complex than a simple act of violence. They point to a calculated erasure, a collective agreement to forget, and a town willing to bury its past along with its dead. The Taney County Historical Society has no record of this incident. The local newspaper archives from November 1912 are conspicuously missing. Even cemetery records show inconsistencies, with several gravestones from that period displaying no dates, only names. It's as if time itself stopped for Ellsworth Creek on that November day. This investigation began in 1962 when Professor Martin Whitaker from the University of Missouri stumbled upon a series of peculiar letters in the estate of the late Harold Keller, grandson of Silas Keller, one of the primary figures in the courthouse dispute. What Whitaker uncovered would lead him down a path of obsession that would ultimately cost him his career, his family, and possibly his sanity. The documents you're about to hear about have since disappeared. The testimonies have been denied. The locations have changed names or been demolished. All that remains is this account, pieced together from fragments of truth hidden between layers of silence. The town of Ellsworth Creek no longer appears on modern maps. The few remaining residents of nearby communities refuse to acknowledge its existence. The dirt road leading to where it once stood has been reclaimed by the dense Ozark forest. But the story remains, preserved in scattered documents, personal diaries, and the haunted memories of those few who still remember. As we begin this journey into one of America's most meticulously concealed tragedies, I must warn you. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. The story of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse Massacre is not just about what happened on that November day in 1912. It's about what happens when a community decides that some truths are better left buried. The Keller family name still carries weight in Taney County, though few connect it to the events of 1912. Their descendants have become respected business owners, politicians, and community leaders. None have ever spoken publicly about their family's involvement in what happened at the courthouse. When approached for this investigation in 1968, the only living Keller from that era, Margaret Keller Wilson, then 89 years old, replied with a single sentence before closing her door: "Some silences protect the living, not the dead." The story begins not with the massacre itself, but with a town divided, a courthouse built on contested land, and a judge with secrets of his own. The true horror of Ellsworth Creek lies not in what was done, but in what was left undone, in the questions never asked, the justice never served, and the truth never acknowledged. This is the story of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse Massacre of 1912, the day when silence became the only witness to horror. In the summer of 1912, Ellsworth Creek was a town of approximately 2,300 residents. Nestled in a narrow valley between two ridges of the Ozark Mountains, it had prospered briefly during a minor mining boom in the 1880s, then settled into the quiet rhythm of an agricultural community. The town centered around a modest main street with the essential businesses: a general store owned by the Harmon family, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, Wilkes's Hardware and Farm Supply, the First Bank of Ellsworth Creek, majority owned by the Kellers, and the Crown Hotel, where traveling salesmen and occasional tourists would stay. County records from 1902 indicate that the original courthouse had burned down under circumstances deemed accidental, though never fully explained. The new courthouse, completed in 1905, stood at the north end of Main Street, an imposing two-story structure of locally quarried limestone with large windows and a modest central dome. Architectural plans found in Jefferson City archives show that the building contained 2 courtrooms, administrative offices, and an unusually large basement area described only as storage and records. What's peculiar about the courthouse construction is that it was built on land donated by Silas Keller, the patriarch of the Keller family, whose timber and mining interests had made them the wealthiest family in the county. According to a deed of transfer dated March 15, 1903, the land was given in perpetuity for the purpose of justice and governance, with an unusual clause that the property would revert to Keller ownership should it cease to serve its intended purpose. The Keller family lived 3 miles outside of town in a large Victorian home set on 200 acres of prime farmland. The family consisted of Silas Keller, then 67, his wife Eleanor, 58, their sons James, 42, and Vincent, 38, and Vincent's wife, Catherine, 29, and their 3 children. James had never married, a fact that occasioned quiet speculation in town, particularly given his close friendship with Edward Merritt, the county clerk. In contrast to the Kellers' wealth stood the farming families of the Eastern Valley, the Prestons, Caldwells, Hardings, and a dozen others, who worked smaller plots of between 20 and 80 acres each. These families had settled the area in the 1870s and 1880s, before the brief mining boom had attracted the Kellers and other investors to the region. A drought in the spring and summer of 1912 had hit these farming families hard. According to meteorological records from Springfield, the region received less than half its normal rainfall between April and August. The crops were failing, and the farmers were increasingly desperate. It was against this backdrop that the land dispute came to court. At issue was the ownership of approximately 400 acres of fertile bottomland along Ellsworth Creek itself. The farmers claimed this land had been commonly used for generations, while the Kellers produced a deed showing they had purchased it from the railroad in 1897. What made the case particularly contentious was that the land contained several natural springs that had become essential water sources during the drought. Judge Everett Holcomb, who would preside over the case, had been appointed to the bench in 1909 after the unexpected death of his predecessor, Judge William Hammond. Records from the Missouri Bar Association describe Holcomb as competent, though unremarkable, in legal acumen. What these records don't mention, but what local church records suggest, is that Holcomb's wife Mary was Catherine Keller's cousin, creating a conflict of interest that was apparently never officially acknowledged. The town itself seemed to hold its breath as the court date approached. The weekly Ellsworth Creek Gazette, now defunct, with archives supposedly lost in a flood in 1931, noted only that tensions remain high, and that Sheriff Allen has requested additional deputies be present for the proceedings. What nobody knew as they prepared for that fateful Tuesday morning was that beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward land dispute lay secrets far darker, secrets tied to the old mining operations, to several unexplained disappearances in the 1890s, and to a sealed section of the courthouse basement that officially didn't exist. The morning of November 12, 1912, dawned cold and gray. According to weather records, the temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit with a light drizzle. The courthouse was set to open at 8:00 a.m., with proceedings scheduled to begin at 9:00. By 7:30, according to a statement later given by Ellsworth Creek's only taxi driver, Howard Price, people were already gathering outside the courthouse despite the unseasonable chill. Price's statement, recorded in 1962 but subsequently retracted, described dropping off Vincent Keller and his wife at the courthouse steps at approximately 8:15 a.m. They didn't look worried, Price recalled. Vincent was talking about some building project, seemed almost excited. His wife didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. Last time I ever saw either of them alive. The most complete account of who was present comes from the court docket for that day, preserved by court clerk Edward Merritt in his personal papers and discovered among his effects after his death in 1954. According to this document, those present included Judge Everett Holcomb, court clerk Edward Merritt, Sheriff Thomas Allen, and two deputies, William Davis and Jack Morris. The plaintiffs, Silas Keller, represented by attorney Hugh Blackwood from Springfield. The defendants, representing the farming families, were Thomas Preston, Joseph Caldwell, and Elijah Harding, with local attorney Daniel Foster court reporter Margaret Wilson, who would later marry into the Keller family. Various spectators, including Vincent and Catherine Keller, James Keller, and approximately 30 members of the farming families and local townspeople. The proceedings began promptly at 9:00 a.m. The court docket indicates that Blackwood opened with a 20-minute statement outlining the Kellers' claim to the disputed land. Foster then presented the farmer's case, emphasizing traditional use and verbal agreements with previous landowners. The last official entry in the docket reads, 10:17 a.m., court calls recess following disturbance in gallery. Sheriff Allen addressing situation. What exactly the disturbance was remains unclear. No further entries appear in the court record. What we do know is that at approximately 12:30 p.m., telegraph operator Samuel Wilson sent an urgent message to the county sheriff's office in the neighboring town of Forsyth. Assistance required immediately at Ellsworth Creek Courthouse. Situation unclear. No response from local law enforcement. By the time deputies from Forsyth arrived at approximately 2:15 p.m., they found the courthouse doors locked from the inside. According to their report, which was filed but later removed from official records, they were met outside by a visibly shaken Edward Merritt, who told them, "It's been handled. There's no need for outside involvement." The Forsyth deputies returned to their jurisdiction without entering the courthouse. No official report of any incident was ever filed. No deaths were recorded in the county register for that day, despite what later evidence would suggest was a significant loss of life. The first indication that something catastrophic had occurred comes from an entry in the diary of Emily Harmon, wife of the general store owner. The entry, dated November 13, 1912, reads only, "Store closed today. George says we're not to speak of it, ever. God forgive us all." For the next several weeks, the Ellsworth Creek Gazette made no mention of the court case, the supposed disturbance, or any deaths. Regular columns and advertisements continued to run, though several businesses, including Wilkes's Hardware, the Crown Hotel, and the Harmon General Store, were noted as temporarily closed without explanation. The December 3, 1912 edition finally contained a small notice. The case of Keller versus Preston et al. Has been resolved privately to the satisfaction of all parties. The community thanks Judge Adams from Forsyth for stepping in to oversee county matters temporarily. Judge Holcomb was never mentioned again in any public record in Ellsworth Creek. Neither were Sheriff Allen or his deputies. Their disappearances went unremarked upon, as did those of several members of the farming families who had been present that day. The first tangible evidence that something truly horrific had occurred came in the form of an expense report from the Ellsworth Creek Bank to Silas Keller, dated November 20th, 1912. The report, discovered in 1963 in a sealed vault in the abandoned bank building, listed payments to a saint, Louis Cleaning Company, a carpentry firm for courthouse repairs, and a substantial payment to each of 6 families, labeled only as settlement in full. By Christmas 1912, according to all available records, life in Ellsworth Creek had returned to normal, or at least to a semblance of normalcy that the remaining residents had collectively agreed to maintain. The courthouse reopened with a new judge, new sheriff, and new court staff. The land dispute was never mentioned again. The disputed property remained uncultivated, gradually returning to wilderness. And in the town cemetery, a new row of graves appeared, simple markers with names but no dates, 17 in all. No funeral services were recorded by either of the town's 2 churches. The silence had begun, a silence that would last for decades, broken only when Professor Whitaker began asking questions that many believed should have remained unasked. In January 1913, just 2 months after the courthouse incident, the Keller family made several significant changes. According to property records, Silas Keller transferred ownership of the family home and most of their local holdings to his son James. Vincent's widow Catherine and her children relocated to St. Louis, where Catherine's maiden name appears in city directories from 1913 to 1926. Silas and Eleanor Keller traveled to Europe in February 1913, ostensibly for an extended vacation. Passenger manifests show them boarding the RMS Mauretania in New York, bound for Southampton. There is no record of their return to the United States. Their names appear in the guest registers of various European hotels until 1916, after which they vanish from all records. James Keller remained in Ellsworth Creek, taking over management of the family businesses. Bank records indicate that under his direction, the Keller interests shifted away from local investments toward ventures in St. Louis, Kansas City, and even Chicago. By 1920, the family maintained only nominal connections to the town where they had once been the dominant force. The most telling document from this period is a letter from James Keller to his sister-in-law Catherine, dated June 1915, found among Catherine's personal effects after her death in 1958. In it, James writes, "The arrangement continues to hold. The new judge is amenable to our interests, and the sheriff understands his role perfectly. Edward sends his regards and assures me that the basement room remains secured. No one asks questions anymore. I sometimes walk through town and marvel at how completely they have trained themselves to forget. Perhaps in time I shall learn to do the same, though the dreams continue to disturb my sleep. Father was right about one thing: silence becomes easier with practice." The farming families who had opposed the Kellers in court largely disappeared from Ellsworth Creek in the years following the incident. County records show that the Preston farm was sold in December 1912 to a corporation called Ozarks Holdings, later revealed to be a Keller shell company. The Caldwell and Harding properties were similarly transferred in early 1913. The most significant development occurred in 1917, when the creek that gave the town its name was dammed to create a small reservoir, flooding much of the disputed bottomland. The project was funded by private investors and approved by the county commissioners without public hearings. The resulting Lake Ellsworth became a minor tourist attraction, drawing fishermen and vacationers during summer months. The courthouse itself underwent significant renovations in 1914, including what building permits described as structural reinforcement of the basement level and installation of improved ventilation systems. The permits were signed by Edward Merritt, who by then had been appointed county administrator. Throughout the 1920s, Ellsworth Creek maintained the appearance of a typical small Ozark town. Population records from the 1920 census show 1,273 residents, a decline from the pre-1912 population, but not dramatically so. New families moved in unaware of what had occurred. The town's collective silence became its defining feature, an unspoken agreement that certain questions would never be asked, certain locations never discussed. It was this silence that first attracted the attention of Martin Whitaker decades later. As he would write in his journal in 1962, It's not what they say, but what they refuse to say, not the stories they tell, but the stories they won't tell. The absence speaks volumes. Ellsworth Creek doesn't just have secrets, it is a secret. By the 1930s, the events of November 1912 might have remained forever buried, if not for the unexpected discovery made by 12-year-old Alice Thornton in the spring of 1934. Alice, whose family had moved to Ellsworth Creek in 1925, was playing along the shores of Lake Ellsworth when unusually low water levels exposed what appeared to be the foundation of an old structure. According to Alice's account, given to Professor Whitaker in 1962, she found a metal box, like a cash box, but bigger, stuck between some rocks where the water had gone down. Inside the box was a leather-bound journal belonging to Sheriff Thomas Allen, whose disappearance after the courthouse incident had never been explained. The journal, which covered the period from January 1912 to November 10, 1912, notably ending 2 days before the massacre, contained several disturbing entries. In an entry dated October 15, 1912, Allen wrote, "Merritt showed me what they found in the old mine shaft today. He says the judge already knows. I don't see how we can allow the case to proceed now, but J.K. insists it will only raise more questions if we delay. The farmers cannot be allowed access to that land under any circumstances. What lies beneath must remain buried for all our sakes." An earlier entry, from September 3rd, hinted at growing tensions. Second threatening letter delivered to the Keller house today. This one mentioned bones that speak of betrayal. Vincent is concerned that someone from the old mining operation has returned. Silas dismisses it as farmer intimidation tactics, but I'm not so certain. There's something in the way Preston watches the courthouse when he thinks no one is looking. Alice Thornton, frightened by what she'd found, showed the journal to her father, who immediately took it to James Keller. According to Alice, her father returned home ashen-faced that evening and told the family they would be moving to Springfield as soon as possible. The Thorntons left Ellsworth Creek within the week, leaving most of their possessions behind. The journal itself disappeared until 1958, when it was anonymously donated to the University of Missouri Archives with no explanation of its provenance. It was this document that first caught Professor Whitaker's attention and led him to Ellsworth Creek. Meanwhile, the town continued its slow decline. The Great Depression hit the region hard, and by 1940, census records show the population had dwindled to just over 1,000 residents. The courthouse, once the town's centerpiece, had fallen into disrepair, with only the first floor still in use for county business. James Keller died in 1947, leaving no direct heirs. His will specified that the remaining Keller properties in Ellsworth Creek should be donated to the county, with the exception of the parcel containing Lake Ellsworth and all lands within 500 yards of its shores, which was deeded to a trust with explicit instructions that the land never be sold or developed. The most curious stipulation in his will concerned the courthouse. The sum of $50,000 is to be held in perpetuity for the maintenance of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse, with particular attention to the security and preservation of the basement level, which is to remain sealed and accessible only to authorized county personnel. Despite this endowment, the courthouse continued to deteriorate. By 1955, county offices had been relocated to Forsyth, and the building stood empty, its windows boarded, its imposing limestone facade stained and crumbling. Local children told stories of strange sounds coming from within, stories dismissed by parents with unusual vehemence. The town of Ellsworth Creek might have faded into obscurity, its secrets intact, if not for a chance discovery in the spring of 1962 that would set in motion a chain of events leading to the final unraveling of the town's carefully maintained silence. In March 1962, the Missouri Highway Department began preliminary work on a new state highway that would pass near what remained of Ellsworth Creek. During soil testing approximately 1 mile east of town, workers uncovered what appeared to be a mass grave containing multiple human remains. The discovery was reported to the Taney County Sheriff's Office, which initially treated the site as a crime scene. However, according to department records obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 1967, the investigation was abruptly terminated after just 2 days when state officials intervened, citing historical significance requiring specialized handling. The remains were removed by a team from the State Archaeological Office and transported to Jefferson City. No public report was ever issued regarding their analysis or final disposition. When Professor Whitaker later attempted to access information about the remains, he was informed that no such records existed. It was this discovery that brought Martin Whitaker, then an associate professor of history at the University of Missouri, to the region. Whitaker had been researching incidents of civil unrest in rural Missouri and had come across references to Ellsworth Creek in newspaper archives from Springfield. Intrigued by the apparent gaps in the historical record, he decided to investigate further. Whitaker's journals, recovered after his disappearance in 1968, provide the most comprehensive account of what he uncovered during his 6-year investigation. His first entry about Ellsworth Creek, dated April 10, 1962, reads, "Something extraordinary happened in this town 50 years ago, something the locals still refuse to discuss. I've conducted interviews with 7 residents today, all over the age of 70, all of whom claim to have no knowledge of any unusual events in 1912. Their denials are too perfect, too rehearsed. One woman, I believe her name was Martha Collins, actually got up and left the room when I mentioned the courthouse. Her daughter followed me outside and warned me to stop asking questions for your own good. This is no ordinary small-town reticence." Whitaker's breakthrough came when he located Edward Merritt's personal papers in the possession of a niece living in Kansas City. Merritt, the court clerk who had survived the massacre, had apparently maintained detailed private records throughout his life, including what appeared to be a coded journal covering the period from 1912 to 1954. Using his background in cryptography from his wartime service, Whitaker spent months deciphering Merritt's journal. What he found confirmed his suspicions about the Courthouse Massacre, but suggested a motive far more complex than a simple land dispute. According to Merritt's decoded entries, the conflict between the Kellers and the farming families had its roots in discoveries made during the mining operations of the 1890s. The Keller Mining Company had uncovered something in one of the deeper shafts, something that Merritt referred to only as the evidence, or sometimes the remains. Whatever this discovery was, it apparently threatened the Kellers' legitimacy in the region and potentially implicated them in serious crimes dating back to the earliest settlement of the area. Merritt's journal suggested that the disputed land contained access to the sealed mine shaft where the evidence was concealed. The most disturbing entry, dated November 13, 1912, stated simply, "It is done. 17 souls silenced. The basement has been prepared according to Silas's specifications. Jay agrees that no one must ever know what lies beneath both the courthouse and the lake. The judge's wife identified the bodies this morning. The official story has been distributed. God help us all." Later entries revealed that Merritt was deeply troubled by his role in what had occurred and in the subsequent cover-up. By the 1940s, his journal entries became increasingly paranoid, suggesting that he was being watched and that they will ensure my silence as they did the others. His final entry, dated just 3 days before his death from an apparent heart attack in 1954, read, "I can carry this burden no longer. I have prepared my testament and placed it where it will be found when the time is right. The truth of Ellsworth Creek must someday be known, if only so that those 17 souls may finally rest." The testament Merritt referred to was never found. Whitaker's investigation, however, continued to uncover fragmented evidence suggesting that the Courthouse Massacre had been a planned elimination of witnesses who had somehow learned about whatever the Kellers were hiding. As Whitaker delved deeper into Ellsworth Creek's past, he became convinced that the key to understanding what had happened lay in accessing the sealed courthouse basement. By 1965, the building had been abandoned for a decade, its ownership in dispute following the dissolution of the Keller Trust. Despite its dilapidated condition, the basement remained secured with surprisingly modern locks. In the summer of 1965, Whitaker managed to gain access to the courthouse through a connection in the county records office. What he found there would lead to his eventual obsession and downfall. Professor Whitaker's final journal entries from August 1965 describe his exploration of the courthouse basement in fragmented, often incoherent terms. The normally methodical academic's handwriting deteriorates over these pages, suggesting extreme agitation or fear. According to these entries, the basement contained not just the expected county records and storage, but a sealed inner chamber accessed through what appeared to be a former coal chute. This chamber had been reinforced with concrete and fitted with a steel door sometime after the original construction. Whitaker's notes indicate that he was able to open this door using keys provided by his contact in the county office. What he found inside was a room approximately 15 feet square, empty except for a trapdoor in the floor, and a small metal cabinet bolted to one wall. The cabinet contained a leather portfolio, stamped with the Keller family crest. Inside were documents dating back to 1871, when the first Kellers arrived in the region. Among these was a handwritten confession from Augustus Keller, Silas's father, acknowledging his involvement in the massacre of a group of Osage people who had refused to leave lands that contained valuable mineral deposits. More disturbing was a series of surveyors' maps showing the location of not just the massacre site, but of several other unmarked graves throughout the region, graves that apparently contained the remains of anyone who had threatened Keller interests over the decades. The trapdoor in the floor led to a narrow shaft that, according to Whitaker's measurements, descended approximately 30 feet before opening into what appeared to be an old mine tunnel. The tunnel extended in the direction of Lake Ellsworth, suggesting it might connect to the submerged, disputed lands. Whitaker's final entry, dated August 17, 1965, reads, "What I found at the end of the tunnel exceeds my worst fears. The scale of what the Kellers have done, what they have hidden, is unimaginable. The Courthouse Massacre was merely the latest in a century of calculated violence. But why maintain the chamber? Why not destroy the evidence entirely? Unless they still return here. Unless whatever lies beneath the lake requires continued attention. I'm going back tomorrow with proper equipment. The truth must be documented, whatever the cost." There is no record of Whitaker returning to the courthouse. On August 18th, a fire of unknown origin severely damaged the structure, collapsing the first floor into the basement. County records list the fire as accidental, possibly caused by transients seeking shelter. Whitaker's behavior changed dramatically following his exploration of the courthouse. Colleagues at the university noted his increasing paranoia and erratic behavior. He withdrew from teaching responsibilities, citing health concerns, and devoted himself entirely to his research on Ellsworth Creek. By early 1966, he had relocated to a small cabin near the former town site, where he lived in increasing isolation. The few locals who interacted with him described him as haunted and obsessed with the lake. He was frequently seen taking water samples and making detailed notes about changes in the water level. In October 1966, Whitaker submitted a manuscript to the University of Missouri Press titled "Silence and Blood: The Hidden History of Ellsworth Creek." The manuscript was rejected, with the editorial board citing insufficient documentation and excessive speculation. No copies of this manuscript are known to exist, as Whitaker reportedly destroyed it after the rejection. His final known communication was a letter to his daughter in St. Louis, dated March 3, 1968. In it he wrote, "I know now why the town maintains its silence even after all these years. It's not just fear or shame. It's something deeper, something in the water, something in the ground itself. I've traced the connections now from the courthouse to the lake to the old Keller estate. They're all connected underground, physically and metaphorically. What happened in 1912 was just one manifestation of something that has been happening here since the first settlers arrived. I have to finish this investigation, for all our sakes. If I don't contact you by the end of the month, send the package I left with you to the address I've enclosed. Tell no one else. The package was never sent. Whitaker's daughter, concerned by the letter's tone, traveled to the Ozarks to check on her father, only to find his cabin empty. His research materials, journals, and photographic evidence had all been removed. The only item remaining was a single page torn from a journal bearing the words, "The water is rising. They're opening the tunnels again." Martin Whitaker was officially declared missing on April 12, 1968. The local sheriff's office conducted what was described as a thorough search of the area, but found no trace of the professor. The case was closed after 2 weeks, with authorities speculating that Whitaker had suffered a mental breakdown and likely left the area voluntarily. His disappearance might have marked the end of the Ellsworth Creek investigation, if not for a series of unusual events that began in the spring of 1969, bringing new attention to the long-buried secrets of the Courthouse Massacre. In April 1969, unusual spring floods caused significant damage throughout the Ozarks. Lake Ellsworth, normally controlled by the small dam constructed in 1917, overflowed its banks, inundating areas that had been dry for decades. As the waters receded in late May, they revealed something that had long been hidden beneath the lake: the foundations of several structures that predated the flooding of the valley. Most significant among these was what appeared to be the entrance to a mine shaft, its timber supports still partially intact despite over 50 years underwater. The discovery attracted the attention of local media, with the Springfield News Leader running a feature on the ghost structures of Lake Ellsworth. The article, published June 2, 1969, included interviews with several elderly residents of the region, none of whom were willing to discuss the history of the lake or the buildings that had once stood on its shores. The reporter, Robert Hawkins, noted this reticence, writing, "When asked about Ellsworth Creek's past, locals display an unusual reluctance to speak. One elderly gentleman, who declined to be named, would say only that some things are better left where they lay, underwater and underground." Following publication of the article, Hawkins began receiving anonymous calls and letters providing fragments of information about Ellsworth Creek and specifically about the events of November 1912. The most significant of these communications was a package containing several pages apparently torn from Edward Merritt's missing testament. These pages, which Hawkins later turned over to state authorities, contained explicit details about the Courthouse Massacre. According to Merritt's account, the violence began when Thomas Preston confronted Judge Holcomb with evidence that the Kellers had falsified their deed to the disputed land. This evidence allegedly included original survey markers and documents proving that the land had been communally owned since before the Kellers arrived in the region. More damning, Preston claimed to have discovered human remains while digging a new well on the contested property, remains that showed signs of violence and that he believed were connected to the disappearance of several Osage people in the 1870s. Merritt's testament described what happened next. The judge tried to call for order, but Silas nodded to Vincent, who locked the courtroom doors. Sheriff Allen reached for his weapon, but James Keller already had his pistol drawn. What happened next occurred with such methodical precision that it must have been planned in advance. Vincent Keller produced a canister from his coat and broke its seal. A strange mist filled the room, not quite a gas, but something that seemed to cling to the skin and enter through the pores. Within moments, those nearest to Vincent began to convulse. No one screamed, no one could. The mist seemed to paralyze the vocal cords while leaving victims fully conscious. I watched from behind the clerk's desk as 17 people, the judge, Sheriff Allen, and his deputies, the farmers and their supporters, even Catherine Keller, who had apparently not been told of the plan, collapsed and died in horrific silence. Their eyes remained open, aware until the last moment. When it was over, Silas calmly instructed James to open the windows. The mist dissipated quickly, leaving no trace. Silas then turned to me and said, "Mr. Merritt, your continued employment and existence depends on your absolute discretion regarding today's unfortunate incident. I trust we understand each other." They moved the bodies that night to the basement chamber that had been prepared in advance. What they did with them afterward, I cannot say with certainty, though I have my suspicions about the true purpose of the dam that would later create Lake Ellsworth. Hawkins's investigation was abruptly terminated when the newspaper received a cease and desist letter from a prominent St. Louis law firm representing the interests of longtime regional landowners. The publisher, citing potential legal costs, reassigned Hawkins to sports coverage. The pages from Merritt's testament, along with Hawkins' notes, were submitted to the Missouri State Police. No investigation was ever officially opened. When Hawkins inquired about the materials 6 months later, he was informed that they had been misplaced during a departmental reorganization. By the end of 1969, the exposed foundations beneath Lake Ellsworth had once again been submerged as water levels returned to normal. The brief window into Ellsworth Creek's hidden past had closed. Local authorities erected no trespassing signs around the lake, citing environmental concerns. The town of Ellsworth Creek itself continued its gradual disappearance. By 1970, census records listed the population as just 86 residents, most elderly. The last business, a small gas station and convenience store, closed in 1974. By 1980, the town had been officially unincorporated, its remaining streets and structures reclaimed by the encroaching forest. Today, little physical evidence remains of Ellsworth Creek or the tragedy that occurred there. The courthouse ruins were demolished in 1972 as part of a county beautification project. Lake Ellsworth remains, though it has been renamed Ozark Memorial Lake, with no reference to its original identity. The Keller name still appears occasionally in regional business and political circles, though no direct descendants of Silas Keller remain in the area. The family's considerable wealth was eventually transferred to various foundations and corporate entities, their origins obscured by decades of careful financial management. What truly happened in the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse on November 12, 1912, may never be fully known. The 17 victims, their names, their faces, their final moments, have been systematically erased from history, their suffering silenced by a conspiracy that spanned generations. Yet something of their story survives in these fragmented accounts, in the reluctant memories of those few who still remember, and in the persistent questions that continue to haunt the hidden corners of Ozark history. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ellsworth Creek massacre is not the violence itself, but the community's complicity in its concealment. How does an entire town agree to forget? What price do they pay for such a silence? And what happens to that silence when the last person who remembers the truth is gone? In the dense forests that now cover the former site of Ellsworth Creek, hikers occasionally report a strange phenomenon: periods of absolute silence when all natural sounds, birds, insects, wind in the leaves, suddenly cease. These episodes reportedly last exactly 17 minutes before normal forest sounds resume. Local guides dismiss these stories as imagination or coincidence, but some still refuse to lead tours near the old town site or the shores of the lake, especially in November, when the silence is said to be most profound. The last known survivor with direct knowledge of the Courthouse Massacre was Margaret Keller Wilson, who died in 1971 at the age of 92. As the court reporter present on that fateful day, she had somehow been spared the fate of the other witnesses, perhaps due to her subsequent marriage into the Keller family. In her final years, suffering from dementia, she was occasionally heard murmuring about the silence in the courthouse and the faces that couldn't scream. Her caregivers attributed these utterances to confusion and nightmare. After her death, a sealed envelope was found among her possessions, addressed simply, "To be opened when the lake runs dry," The envelope was reportedly burned unopened by her grandson, who told others, "Some doors should remain closed. Whether those doors will stay closed forever remains to be seen. The land remembers what people choose to forget. The water holds secrets that may yet rise to the surface. And in the deep silence of the Ozark forests, 17 voices wait to be heard." For those who seek to uncover the full truth of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse Massacre, a warning: silence can be more than the absence of sound. Sometimes it's the presence of something else entirely, something that has learned to move and breathe and watch from the spaces between words, from the shadows between thoughts. The town that chose to forget may be gone, but its silence remains, a silence that continues to spread, page by page, whisper by whisper, reaching even now toward you. You're right, and I apologize for the error. Let me continue and expand the script to reach the proper length for a 1-hour narration, 55,000, 65,000 characters. The Ellsworth Creek tragedy extends far beyond what I've covered so far. Let me continue with more details about the investigation, the town's collective silence, and the deeper implications of what was discovered beneath the courthouse and lake. In the decades following the events at Ellsworth Creek, numerous attempts were made to piece together what truly happened that November day. Each investigation seemed to uncover new layers of horror, new dimensions to the silence that had consumed the town and its inhabitants. One particularly disturbing account came from Harold Jenkins, who served as a deputy in Taney County from 1948 to 1962. In a recorded interview conducted in 1967 but never broadcast, Jenkins described an incident that occurred during the spring floods of 1952. "We got a call about something washing up on the shore of Lake Ellsworth. This was during that big flood, when the water rose almost 15 feet above normal. Me and Sheriff Collins drove out there, expecting to find a drowned deer or maybe some old farming equipment. What we found instead, here." Jenkins paused for nearly 30 seconds before continuing. "What we found was a metal container, like an old-time steamer trunk, but made of some kind of thick-gauge steel. The flood had dislodged it from somewhere and washed it up against a stand of sycamores near the old dam." Jenkins claimed that when they managed to open the container, they found it packed with personal effects: watches, wedding rings, eyeglasses, wallets, and other items that would have been carried by courthouse visitors. Each item was carefully wrapped in oilcloth and labeled with initials, 17 packages in all. Sheriff told me to reseal the trunk and help him load it in the cruiser. When I asked what we were going to do with it, he just said, "Same thing they did in 12, nothing." We drove it to the Keller estate, not the old house, which had been abandoned by then, but to that caretaker's cottage where James Keller's lawyer lived. The lawyer didn't seem surprised to see us. He just nodded and had his groundskeeper take the trunk around back. Next day, Sheriff Collins called me into his office and said if I ever mentioned what we found to anyone, I'd be fired on the spot. Said it was a county matter that predated both of us. Jenkins's account provides a rare glimpse into how the conspiracy of silence was maintained across generations, with local authorities continuing to protect the Keller family interests decades after the massacre. It also suggests that the 17 victims were not just killed, but systematically stripped of their identities, their personal belongings preserved as some kind of macabre inventory. Further evidence of this multi-generational cover-up emerged in 1963, when a retired postmaster from a neighboring town revealed that, for decades, mail addressed to certain families, the Prestons, Caldwells, and others who had disappeared after the courthouse incident, continued to be delivered to a special post office box registered to the Keller Mining Company. This arrangement had apparently been established in December 1912 and continued until 1947, when James Keller died. The implication was clear. The Kellers had not only eliminated witnesses, but had gone to extraordinary lengths to create the illusion that these people had simply moved away. Responses to letters were reportedly forged, occasional money orders sent to distant relatives, change of address forms periodically updated. An entire paper trail of false lives had been manufactured to cover 17 deaths. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ellsworth Creek case involves what Professor Whitaker discovered beneath the lake, a discovery referenced in his final journal entries but never fully explained. Based on fragmented notes and the recollections of locals who spoke with Whitaker in his final months, a troubling picture emerges. The area now covered by Lake Ellsworth had indeed contained several mine shafts dating back to the 1880s. According to geological surveys from that period, these mines had been abandoned after yielding only modest amounts of lead and zinc. However, Whitaker's research suggested that the official reports had been falsified, and that the Kellers had discovered something else in those depths, something they went to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Several references in Whitaker's notes point to unusual archaeological findings. Pre-Columbian remains unlike any documented culture, artifacts of non-indigenous design, and, most cryptically, evidence of practices inconsistent with known human societies. These fragments suggest that the Kellers may have discovered an ancient site of some significance, perhaps a burial ground or settlement that predated known Native American habitation of the region. More ominously, both Merritt's coded journal and Whitaker's notes contain references to ongoing activity at the site long after the mines were officially closed. Entries describe midnight excavations, specimens transported under guard, and continued alterations to the chamber. Whatever the Kellers found in those mines, they apparently continued to interact with it for decades. The creation of Lake Ellsworth in 1917 takes on new significance in this context. While publicly presented as a recreational and water management project, the lake effectively sealed off access to whatever lay beneath. The unusual clause in James Keller's will prohibiting development or sale of the lake property suggests that this concealment was intended to be permanent. Several local accounts gathered by Whitaker describe strange phenomena associated with the lake. Unusual temperature variations, unexplained sounds coming from beneath the surface, periods when the water took on an unnatural clarity, allowing glimpses of the structures below. One elderly fisherman claimed that on certain moonless nights, the lake seemed to emit a faint luminescence, like when swamp gas catches the light, but there weren't no light to catch. Water samples collected by Whitaker and analyzed at the university laboratory reportedly showed trace elements not typically found in Ozark water sources, including unusual concentrations of rare earth metals and organic compounds that could not be immediately identified. The professor's notes indicate that he sent more comprehensive samples to a specialized facility in Chicago, but no record of the results exists. The connection between whatever lay beneath the lake and the Courthouse Massacre becomes clearer through a careful reading of the available evidence. The disputed land that brought the farmers into conflict with the Keller family encompassed not just the future lake bed, but also extended to an area that included one of the primary mine entrances. Thomas Preston's discovery of human remains while digging a well on this land suggests that he may have inadvertently uncovered evidence of either the Kellers' earlier crimes or perhaps something connected to the original archaeological site. The sealed chamber beneath the courthouse appears to have served as both a disposal site for the massacre victims and a secondary access point to whatever lay below. The tunnel that Whitaker described connecting the courthouse basement to the direction of the lake indicates a carefully planned infrastructure designed to allow discrete movement between these locations. Most disturbing is the possibility that the massacre itself may have served a purpose beyond merely eliminating witnesses. Merritt's testament makes reference to the bodies being prepared in the basement chamber before being transferred to the primary site. This suggests that the victims may have been incorporated in some way into whatever was being maintained beneath the lake, a prospect too horrifying to contemplate fully. In the years following Whitaker's disappearance, several other researchers attempted to investigate the Ellsworth Creek case. None progressed as far as the professor had, and several reported experiences that caused them to abandon their inquiries. A graduate student from St. Louis University described being followed by unmarked vehicles whenever she visited the area in 1972. A freelance journalist from Kansas City claimed that his research notes were repeatedly stolen from his hotel room during a 1976 visit. A documentary filmmaker in 1980 reported equipment failures whenever he attempted to film near the lake or the former town site. By the mid-1980s, the area had been largely reclaimed by nature. The lake remained now managed by a private conservation trust with strict access limitations. The former town site had been incorporated into Mark Twain National Forest, with no markers or indications of its history. County maps no longer showed Ellsworth Creek, and regional histories made only passing reference to a small settlement abandoned during the Depression. The systematic erasure of Ellsworth Creek from official records and public memory represents a success for those who orchestrated the silence. Yet fragments of the truth persist in scattered documents, in the reluctant memories of aging descendants, and in the unnatural quiet that still pervades the forest around the former town site. In 1994, during an unusually severe drought, Lake Ellsworth's water level dropped dramatically, once again revealing portions of the structures beneath. A forest ranger patrolling the area reported finding an opening that appeared to lead into the old mine system. Following protocol for potentially hazardous abandoned mines, he contacted the State Department of Natural Resources. According to the ranger's subsequent report, when he returned to the site the following day with DNR officials, the opening had been filled with freshly poured concrete. No record of this work exists in county or state maintenance logs. When the ranger inquired about the discrepancy, he was informed that the matter had been addressed by private landowners with historical claims to subsurface rights. This incident suggests that even 80 years after the Courthouse Massacre, some entity remained vigilant in maintaining the secrets beneath the lake. The question of who continues to guard this silence long after the original Keller family has disappeared remains unanswered. The last documented investigation into the Ellsworth Creek case was conducted by Dr. Eleanor Tanner, a forensic anthropologist who became interested in the story while researching patterns of historical violence in rural communities. In 2002, Dr. Tanner attempted to locate the remains of the massacre victims using ground-penetrating radar in areas around the former town site. Her preliminary findings, published in an obscure academic journal, identified several anomalies consistent with unmarked burial sites in a wooded area approximately 1 mile from the former courthouse location. Before she could conduct excavations, however, the land was purchased by the Ozarks Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization later found to be funded primarily by a trust established through the last will and testament of Margaret Keller Wilson. The foundation quickly designated the area as a protected woodland sanctuary, where ground disturbance was prohibited. Dr. Tanner's research permits were revoked, and her funding grant was unexpectedly canceled. When she attempted to pursue the matter through legal channels, she encountered what she described as institutional resistance at every level. In her final publication on the subject, Dr. Tanner wrote, "The Ellsworth Creek case represents more than just an historical murder mystery or an example of rural corruption. It appears to be something far more systemic, a multi-generational conspiracy of silence maintained through a combination of legal maneuvering, economic influence, and perhaps more direct forms of intimidation. What remains unclear is why such extraordinary efforts would continue to be exerted nearly a century after the original events, and who exactly is directing these efforts now that the primary perpetrators are long dead. This question, who continues to guard the silence, may provide the key to understanding the true nature of what happened at Ellsworth Creek. The Keller family, as originally constituted, no longer exists. The town itself has vanished. Most of those with direct knowledge of the events have died. Yet the machinery of concealment continues to function with remarkable efficiency. One theory suggested in Professor Whitaker's notes is that the Keller family transferred responsibility for maintaining the secret to some larger entity, perhaps a corporation, government agency, or private institution with the resources to ensure indefinite protection. Whitaker speculated that whatever was discovered beneath Ellsworth Creek might have had scientific, historical, or even strategic value that extended far beyond the interests of a single family. A more disturbing possibility is that the need for secrecy relates not to what was found, but to what was done with it. Both Merritt's testament and Whitaker's notes contain oblique references to experiments, procedures, and continued operations conducted in the subterranean chambers. If the Kellers were engaged in some form of ongoing research or exploitation involving their discovery, the consequences might necessitate permanent concealment. Perhaps most unsettling is the suggestion, found in Whitaker's final journal entries, that the secret of Ellsworth Creek might maintain itself, that whatever lies beneath the lake might have some agency or influence that perpetuates the silence surrounding it. This would explain why those who begin to investigate the case so often abandon their efforts, why evidence repeatedly vanishes, and why the very memory of the town seems to be fading from collective consciousness. In 2008, a hydrological study of the Ozark watershed produced unexpected data about Lake Ellsworth. Sensors detected temperature variations and chemical compositions inconsistent with other bodies of water in the region. More strikingly, audio equipment recorded sub-audible vibrations emanating from beneath the lake bed, rhythmic patterns that one researcher described as almost linguistic in structure. Before these findings could be properly analyzed, the study was discontinued due to budget constraints. The primary data was subsequently lost during a server migration. When a FOIA request was filed to recover this information in 2012, the response indicated that no such study had been conducted. The centennial of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse Massacre passed unmarked and unacknowledged in November 2012. No memorial exists for the 17 victims. No historical marker commemorates the town that was systematically erased. The only acknowledgement of this anniversary appeared in a small regional folklore journal, which published an article titled "The Town That Chose to Forget: Collective Silence as Cultural Practice in the Ozarks." The author noted that even a century later, residents of neighboring communities displayed unusual reticence when asked about Ellsworth Creek. One elderly interviewee, identified only as a lifelong resident of Taney County, offered this cryptic response: "Some silences are just silences, empty spaces where sound should be. But the silence around that place is different. It's full of something that doesn't want to be heard." This distinction between empty silence and filled silence perhaps best captures the essential horror of the Ellsworth Creek case. It is not merely that a tragic event has been forgotten or suppressed. It is that the act of suppression itself has taken on a life of its own, becoming an active force that continues to shape reality around it. Visitors to the region today will find no trace of Ellsworth Creek on modern maps. Lake Ellsworth, now called Ozark Memorial Lake, appears as a minor recreational area with limited public access. The forest has reclaimed most of the town site, though careful observers might notice certain unnatural regularities in the landscape. The two-straight line of an old street, the subtle rectangle of a former foundation, the circular depression of a filled-in well. The courthouse location, once the center of the community, now lies beneath a stand of oak trees estimated to be about 50 years old. Nothing distinguishes this spot from the surrounding forest except a peculiar quality noted by several visitors: an unusual stillness, as if the normal sounds of the woods are somewhat muted here. One recent visitor, a hiker who strayed from the marked trails in 2018, reported finding a small clearing near this location where the ground appeared to have subsided, revealing what looked like a man-made stone structure beneath. When he returned the following day with a camera, the depression had been filled and covered with fresh soil and pine needles. No storms or maintenance crews had been reported in the area. The last known direct connection to the original events may be found in the person of Thomas Keller Wilson, the great-grandson of Margaret Keller Wilson and the current trustee of the family foundation that maintains ownership of certain land parcels around the lake. Now, in his 70s, Wilson has consistently declined interviews regarding his family history. Public records indicate that he visits the region exactly once per year, staying for precisely 3 days before returning to his primary residence in Boston. These visits always occur in November, coinciding with the anniversary of the Courthouse Massacre. Local service providers report that Wilson brings with him specialized equipment in sealed cases, though the nature of this equipment remains unknown. He always visits the lake alone, typically at night, and has been observed carrying what appears to be small offering of some kind, described by one witness as like flowers, but not flowers exactly. Whatever ritual Wilson performs during these visits, it apparently satisfies whatever obligation the family still maintains toward whatever lies beneath Ellsworth Creek. The silence continues, the secret remains protected, and the 17 victims of the Courthouse Massacre remain unmourned, except by those few who have pieced together this fragmented history. For those who continue to investigate the case, a pattern emerges. Initial interest leads to mounting obsession, followed by increasing paranoia, and ultimately to abandonment of the search or, in some cases, disappearance of the researcher. Those who delve too deeply describe a growing sense of being watched, not just by human agents, but by something less definable, a presence that seems to exert pressure on the mind itself. As one investigator wrote, before abruptly terminating his research, "It's not that I'm being threatened, it's that I'm being convinced, influenced, to accept that some questions shouldn't be answered, some doors shouldn't be opened. The most terrifying aspect is how reasonable this suddenly seems, how the silence begins to feel protective rather than concealing. This psychological dimension may be the most insidious aspect of the Ellsworth Creek case, the way in which the silence seems capable of reproducing itself in those who encounter it, generating a contagious conviction that some secrets are better left undisturbed. Yet the truth remains, buried beneath layers of deception, protected by mechanisms both human and perhaps otherwise, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to risk not just external opposition, but the internal pull toward complicity in the silence. The final testimony regarding Ellsworth Creek comes from an unexpected source, a hospice nurse who attended Thomas Keller Wilson during his last days in 2022. According to her account, shared anonymously with a regional historical society, Wilson spent his final hours in a state of increasing agitation, repeatedly attempting to communicate something about the obligation and the feeding. In his last lucid moment, he allegedly grasped the nurse's hand and whispered, "It's hungry again. Always hungry. But there's no one left to feed it now. Listen for the silence. When it stops, that's when you should worry. When the silence stops, it means it's found another way out." Wilson died before he could explain these cryptic statements. His body was cremated immediately, in accordance with instructions in his will. The nurse who reported his final words left her position shortly afterward and has not been located since. The Wilson Family Trust, which had maintained ownership of the lake property for generations, was dissolved following Thomas's death. Ownership of the land transferred to a newly formed entity called the Ozarks Ecological Research Consortium, which immediately began construction of a research station near the lake shore. Satellite imagery shows this facility to be a windowless concrete structure with significant underground components and an unusually high security perimeter. No public announcements have been made regarding the nature of research being conducted at this facility. Local employment records indicate that most workers are brought in from outside the region, and deliveries to the site occur primarily at night. In a final disturbing development, hydrologists monitoring the region's watershed have noted a gradual but steady drop in Lake Ellsworth's water level over the past year, despite normal precipitation patterns. Current projections suggest that if this trend continues, portions of the lakebed could be exposed within the next 5 years, potentially revealing whatever has lain hidden beneath those waters for over a century. Whether this exposure will finally bring answers or merely deeper questions remains to be seen. The silence of Ellsworth Creek has endured for generations, maintained through means both mundane and perhaps more mysterious. But all silences eventually must end. For those who continue to seek the truth about what happened in that courthouse in 1912, and what may still lie beneath the lake that covers the town's darkest secrets, a word of caution. Some investigations change more than just our understanding of the past. Some secrets once uncovered cannot be buried again, and some silences, once broken, release things that cannot be silenced again. The town of Ellsworth Creek may have been erased from maps and memories, but its legacy continues in the sealed records, in the unmarked graves, in the waters of a lake that should not exist, and in the persistent, filled silence that surrounds it all. Listen carefully should you visit those quiet woods. The silence speaks, if you know how to hear it. 17 voices, still waiting for justice. And perhaps something else, waiting beneath the waters, growing hungry after more than a century of patient darkness. The truth of Ellsworth Creek remains buried, but not dead, never dead, just waiting in silence.